Hi, welcome back to Examining Life. My name is Amanda, and today I am at the American University of Paris, and I'm speaking with Professor Culp. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Julian Culp, and I'm assistant professor of philosophy at the American University of Paris, where I focus on issues of ethics, political philosophy, and philosophy of education in a globalized and digitalized world.
So today we'll be discussing two papers that Professor Culp wrote. They are on the topics of development and ethics. Would you like to give a brief summary?
All right, so these papers were written for a Routledge handbook on development ethics, edited by two colleagues, Jade Rydick and Laurie Kellerer. And the idea was to offer a summary of the contemporary literature on the one hand, international responsibility, discussing which reasons there are for taking up and assuming international responsibility, and for which kinds of actors have actually responsibility at the international level. So that was the focus of the responsibility paper. And the other paper, called Global and Social Justice in Development, focused on the relevance that theories of social and especially global justice have for thinking through concerns of development, be it regarding the meaning, the conception of development, or what it means in terms of responsibilities for bringing about development, whatever that term development then might stand for.
Wonderful, thank you. So in your paper, International Responsibility, you quote the former president from the World Bank, Robert McNamara, and the quote is, "The fundamental case for development assistance is a moral one. The whole of human history has recognized the principle, at least in the abstract, that the rich and powerful have a moral obligation to assist the poor and the weak." I interpreted this in a couple ways. First, given that he works for the World Bank, it's in his interest to say that because it continues to promote the strength of the US dollar in giving out loans and then having them repaid back in dollars and not in their local currencies. He also neglects to mention anything about South-South cooperations, which I think also are really important for development. Maybe if you can talk a little bit more about his intentions of what that quote means, and then also maybe where South-South cooperations fit in morally in the development process.
Yeah, so the World Bank president made this statement in 1970 in his so-called Nairobi speech, in which he laid out basic principles for regulating the practices of the World Bank. And the statement that you just referred to, namely that there's this obligation of the rich to assist the poor and the weak, he made in a certain reflection upon the failures of the development policies of the 50s and 60s, where the idea has been to promote economic growth, and then through trickle-down effects, this economic growth would eventually also benefit the poorest and weakest of society. Okay. In the early 70s already, there was this recognition that trickle-down, at least in the development project, didn't really work out well. We by now know that trickle-down also doesn't work that well in most advanced economies in other parts of the world. However, in that particular quote, he refers to these development projects and the fact that they have neglected the weak and the poor, and that the weak and the poor should actually be the center of the concern of development initiatives, which has also been the focus of many like-minded initiatives that were then focusing on basic needs rather than economic growth, putting people first, putting basic needs first rather than just the abstract idea of producing economic growth, which means nothing more than more material goods, which may or may not benefit the least well off. So this is the intention, I think, namely to focus on the least well off in development projects rather than just economic growth as an aggregate indicator and number. Of course, this focus might still be self-serving. Certainly that is the case and is problematic and important to reflect, especially given the history of international development, in which oftentimes projects have been carried out so as to create employment for Americans or for Europeans, or so as to facilitate contracts for domestic American or European countries in other states. So there is indeed a kind of irony if the World Bank speaks of the moral obligation, if oftentimes it seems as if the World Bank is actually promoting the economic or sometimes also geopolitical interests of the donor countries. So it's important not to take everything for granted of this sort of moral language. You're certainly right in that respect. Regarding South-South cooperation, which is the other point you just mentioned, in the early 70s, the world was much more divided between a wealthy northern part and a poor southern part of the world. By now, 50 years later, this has changed dramatically. We now have a multipolar world in which China and India, in particular, are economic superpowers. Also, many other countries have made enormous economic progress. Turkey, for example, has been very successful, so that today when we talk about development, we can no longer talk about just North-South relations, but also we have to talk about South-South relationships and also think of the moral obligations and relationships between these different types of actors, which is something that moral theory and political philosophy, I must say, has tended to neglect. At least the liberal mainstream of political philosophy has focused very much on the North-South relationships and not focused so much on the relationships between countries or actors from southern states. Yes, that's correct.
So now, as you mentioned, there's kind of like a spectrum of developing countries. It's like there's some that are still developing but more developed than others, and then there's some that are still very in the development process. So is there even a moral obligation, or should there be even a moral obligation within the developing world where the ones that are still developing but are more better off, should they be engaging more with other developing countries? And how at their root can actually bring up the other developing countries?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Again, given the multipolarity of the present political and economic situation, globally speaking, and in particular due to countries such as India or China, Turkey to some extent as well, that are reasonably well off, economically speaking, and which for this reason could be very effective and instrumental in helping out other countries, but also in part because they possess other kinds of knowledge that northern Western countries may not possess, such as how to overcome certain economic development barriers or impediments that they have confronted themselves a few years or decades ago. So they might have special knowledge that they could also transmit to other countries, which is why these countries, say in between the very rich and the very poor countries, might actually be some countries with particular expertise. Having said that, it's also important not to focus solely on the national level and not to look only at national aggregate indicators, because thereby we lose track of the fact that capital and wealth is spread out also among different classes globally. So you have super rich individuals in places like Sao Paulo or Lagos or Accra that are much more wealthy than people in Paris or in other European cities, and which are for that reason way better placed than average citizens who may have precarious work conditions in European or North American countries relative to these very wealthy, well-to-do individuals or families or other groups in not so wealthy countries.
To what extent should we even be having a discussion about development here in the West? Because I feel two ways about this. One is, yes, we should donate by moral obligation, because if we have more, we shouldn't be selfish, and so giving to developing countries would help them develop their economy and various sectors. So the selfishness aspect would be a negative thing, but at least based on my experience when I studied in Ghana, I felt that development should happen from within, because if funds are just given, it might take care of a project temporarily, but not necessarily maintain it, such as roads. And then also, where's the line between we're not being selfish and neo-colonialism? Because I also feel like whoever has the money and the donations also has a certain degree of power. The West maintaining that power doesn't necessarily allow developing countries to develop, in a sense that they get to create their own countries.
So in general, I think it's pretty well established in the empirical literature that long-term economic, social, and political development on the national level only occurs endogenously. That is, if there are changes at the national level that will actually bring about these long-term effects. Having said that, it's not as if these endogenous developments would be independent from a country's relationship to other countries. Okay. So the fact that colonialism has taken place, that the practice of slavery has been established for many centuries, and the effects that this has had on racism and related prejudices about certain countries, all means that the endogenous factors are to a high extent deeply shaped by these external relationships of these countries with other countries and with individuals from other countries, as a consequence of which these endogenous factors cannot be viewed in an isolated manner. However, looking forward, it remains the case that there's relatively little that outside actors can do in order to change these national factors, such as the political culture of a country.
That would be lessening their sovereignty and taking away their sovereignty as a state.
That would oftentimes contribute to that, although I think one shouldn't overestimate the effect that international actors have on national politics. In general, one can make few claims that are valid in all countries, so depending on the country we're looking at, it will be quite a different story that we would have to tell. But in some countries, it certainly is the case that international actors are relatively non-consequential, just because local domestic factors have much more of an impact, such that the international community or international actors cannot actually bring about as much change as one might wish. Regarding the neo-colonialism question that you mentioned, I think that's certainly a big problem, and a problem that has been involved in development projects ever since their inception. After all, most of the development ministries actually have grown out of colonial offices. Colonial offices were called development offices that eventually later became development ministries administered by international organizations. So there's a clear continuation, historically speaking, from the colonial project to the development project, and therefore it's easy to think of development project as neo-colonial projects. Having said that, not always when power is involved and when people exercise power, that power is exercised in an unjustifiable manner. So just because some people have more power than others doesn't mean that the exercise of the power is necessarily unjustified. If you think of the analogous case at the national level and think of certain welfare redistribution mechanisms at the national level, clearly we oftentimes think that these are imposing certain values on other people. If we ask them to work so that they then receive certain social welfare payments on that condition, still, although this might involve the exercise of power, it might be viewed as a domestic form of colonialism of the elites vis-a-vis the less privileged within a particular country. But oftentimes you would nevertheless think that overall this practice is justified because, say, giving out social welfare payments to those who cannot find a job, who have certain impairments that prevent them from working, is a good thing overall, despite the fact that a certain exercise of power, which is potentially dominating, is involved in these kinds of practices.
To what degree does development mean that developing countries then have to look like us? Meaning, like, they have to develop in the way that the West developed?
Yeah, that's of course a huge problem if development means the end of a country's own self-determination, because the future is already presented by other societies present, so to speak, because that is the future that they themselves are going to reach eventually. So that kind of development, which presupposes a unilinear understanding of history and of social progress and development, is certainly problematic and flawed, recognizing the multiplicity of different kinds of modernities, different kinds of trajectories that societies can take. And if you endorse a view of development which is democratic and which basically says that development takes place as democratic self-governing practices unfold, then certainly the particular instantiation of this idea of democratic self-government will be different in different places, and it will be not the case that all countries will be looking alike.
You lay out different theories in your paper, but how can we turn the theory into action? Or how much time should be spent on theory versus actually doing something?
Yeah, that's very, very tough questions, and of course philosophers tend to be more oriented towards theory rather than practice, though I think this dichotomy is not as stark as one might think in the first place, because our actions are influenced by the ideas that are accepted within our social and political environment, within our culture, and certainly we can observe that there are certain patterns of action due to certain cultural beliefs that have formed as a consequence of theoretical investigation. This means that eventually the practical effect of a theory will not be visible in any near future, though nevertheless at some point in the future it might have quite a big effect through teaching, through discussion, through public discourse. After all of these are ways in which ideas can actually also become practically relevant. And of course, if we think of our political world, if we think of continuing relevance of Marxism, the relevance of liberalism, the relevance of post-colonial thought for our present day struggles, also feminist theory has played a very important role for the way in which we think of ourselves presently, and that all means that the theory also has a practical upshot, although it's not so immediate as one often hopes, perhaps.
Thank you very much for your time and discussing your papers with me. I really appreciate it. Let me know in the comments below what you think of development and whether or not we have a moral obligation to help developing countries. And please like and subscribe. Happy travels. Thank you. Bye.